The thick mud of the town square caked against Sarah's bare knees as a heavy hand shoved her to the earth. The cold autumn rain mixed with the dirt, soaking through her threadbare cotton dress. Mayor Higgins stood over her, his polished leather boots dripping with filth. He pointed a thick, trembling finger at her face, his voice booming across the crowded square. "She took it," the mayor bellowed to the angry crowd. "The bank vault was cleaned out last night, and this heavy thief is the only one who had the keys to the back parlor." Sarah wept, her hands trembling as she looked up at the circle of angry faces. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps that strained the tight fabric of her cheap, worn-out dress. The townspeople pressed closer, their eyes filled with a cruel, burning hatred. "Look at her," a shopkeeper yelled, spitting into the mud near her feet. "Always hiding in the corners, stuffing her face with what she steals from honest folks." A loud burst of mocking laughter erupted from the front of the mob. They looked at her wide hips and heavy frame, using her size as a weapon to fuel their growing rage. "Probably took 3 men's worth of gold just to feed herself," a voice shouted from the back. Sarah pulled her frayed shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to hide her full figure from their piercing glares. The sharp stones on the ground cut into her palms as she begged for mercy. "I didn't touch the gold, Mr. Higgins, I swear to you," Sarah sobbed, her voice cracking under the weight of her terror. "I was scrubbing the floors until midnight. Your son saw me there." The mayor's son, a smirking young man in a silk vest, stepped forward and shook his head with cold indifference. "She is lying, father," the boy said, crossing his arms. "I saw her sneaking toward the safe just before the lamps went out." The crowd roared in fury, several men reaching for a thick hemp rope hanging from the hitching post. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird as rough hands grabbed her by the arms. They dragged her toward the old oak tree in the center of the square, her boots scraping uselessly in the mire. The crowd jeered, tossing fistfuls of wet dirt that splattered across her face and neck. "String her up, before she eats the whole town out of house and home," a blacksmith roared, tightening the noose. Sarah closed her eyes, the cold rain washing the tears down her dirt-stained cheeks. No one in this God-forsaken frontier town would ever stand up for a poor, lonely woman like her. Suddenly, a sound like thunder cracked through the valley, silencing the screaming mob in an instant. The heavy, rhythmic pounding of iron horseshoes struck the wet earth with terrifying speed. A massive, midnight black stallion tore around the corner of the saloon, scattering the outer edges of the crowd. The horse was huge, its chest lathered in white foam, carrying a rider who loomed like an omen of death. Silas Vance held the reins with one gloved hand, his long black duster coat billowing behind him like a dark cloud. He pulled the stallion to a hard halt right in front of the oak tree, the animal kicking up wet clay. Silas did not say a word at first, his piercing gray eyes scanning the frightened faces of the townspeople. He unlooped a heavy, double-barreled shotgun from his saddle holster with agonizing slowness. The crowd stepped back, a collective gasp echoing through the square as they recognized the richest and most ruthless rancher in the territory. Silas dismounted, his silver spurs jingling softly in the dead silence that had gripped the town. He walked straight toward Sarah, his massive shoulders completely blocking her shivering form from the mob. The mayor stepped forward, his face turning pale, though he tried to maintain his arrogant posture. "Now see here, Silas," Higgins stammered, raising his hands. "This is town business. The big girl stole the bank's reserves." Silas didn't look at the mayor. He looked down at Sarah, his stern face softening for a fraction of a second as he saw her bruised wrists. He extended a large, calloused hand, lifting her from the mud with effortless strength. Sarah trembled against his side, shocked by the sudden warmth of his massive frame shielding her from the wind. Silas turned his gaze back to the mayor, his jaw tight, his thumb slowly clicking the hammer of his shotgun back. The click resonated through the square like a gunshot, making the mayor flinch. Silas leaned forward, his voice a low, gravelly growl that made the hairs on the back of everyone's neck stand up. Before we reveal the shocking words he whispered that changed her life forever, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a single moment of this breathtaking story. Silas stared into the mayor's cowardly eyes, the barrel of his shotgun pointing directly at the man's chest. "If anyone touches another hair on this woman's head," Silas whispered, his voice dripping with ice, "I will burn this entire valley to the ground, with you in it." The mayor stepped back, his expensive leather boots slipping in the slick mud as his face drained of all color. The angry mob that had been screaming for Sarah's blood just moments ago became completely paralyzed under Silas's gaze. "You're defending her, Silas?" the mayor stammered, his voice shaking as he looked at the heavy shotgun. "She is nothing but a lying, oversized servant girl who ruined my bank." Silas didn't answer with words. He simply took one step forward, his massive frame towering over the older man. The sheer physical presence of the grim cowboy forced the mayor to stumble backward, nearly tripping over his own son. Sarah stood frozen behind Silas, her hands trembling violently as she tried to wipe the wet clay from her face. She could hear the heavy, steady rhythm of Silas's breathing, a stark contrast to her own panicked, shallow gasps. For years, she had been the punchline of every cruel joke in this miserable frontier town. They used her full figure, her wide hips, and her soft, heavy curves to justify treating her like livestock. She spent 14 hours a day scrubbing the floors of the mayor's boarding house, her knees aching and her fingers bleeding. Her daily wages were barely enough to buy a stale loaf of bread and a scrap of salted pork. When her old boots fell apart, she had to wrap her feet in burlap sacks because the cobbler laughed her out of his shop. "We don't make shoes for horses, Sarah," the cobbler had sneered, while a group of deputies laughed from the porch. She remembered walking back to her damp, freezing cellar room that night, crying silently in the dark. Nobody ever looked at her with kindness, and nobody ever asked if she was cold, tired, or hungry. To the townspeople, her plus-size body meant she was durable, a beast of burden meant to take abuse without complaining. The mayor's son, Julian, had been the absolute worst of her tormentors over the past few months. He would purposely knock over buckets of dirty water just to watch her strain her heavy body to clean it up. "Look at the way she waddles," Julian would whisper loudly to his friends whenever Sarah carried heavy logs to the fireplace. Just 2 days ago, Julian had cornered her in the pantry, his eyes tracking the full curve of her hips with malice. When she pushed him away, he called her a miserable, ugly cow and promised she would regret insulting him. Now, looking at the empty bank vault and the missing gold, Sarah realized Julian had planned this nightmare all along. The town was looking for a scapegoat, and a poor, friendless woman with no family was the perfect target. Silas reached down, picking up Sarah's ruined, muddy shawl from the ground with his gloved hand. He shook the dirt from the fabric and gently placed it back over her trembling, full shoulders. "Get in the carriage, Sarah," Silas said, his voice low and commanding, yet surprisingly gentle directed at her. Sarah blinked through her tears, looking at the luxurious black leather carriage waiting at the edge of the square. "But, Mr. Vance, the mayor says I can't leave," she whispered, her voice cracking with pure exhaustion. Silas turned his head slightly, his cold gray eyes locking onto hers for a brief, intense second. "I don't care what a dead man says," Silas replied quietly, his hand remaining firmly on the grip of his shotgun. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as Silas escorted Sarah toward the waiting vehicle. Not a single man in the mob dared to raise a hand or speak a word as the heavy-set woman walked past them. They could see the raw, explosive violence simmering just beneath the surface of the quiet rancher's stoic expression. Silas opened the carriage door, holding it steady as Sarah stepped up, her heavy frame causing the iron springs to groan. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel ashamed of her weight. Silas didn't even blink as he assisted her inside. He closed the door firmly, locking her away from the hateful glares of the town before mounting his black stallion. With a sharp snap of his leather reins, Silas led the carriage out of the muddy square, leaving the stunned town behind. Sarah pressed her face against the glass window, watching the miserable wooden buildings of the town fade into the gray rain. She was safe for now, but she knew the greedy mayor would not let his gold or his vengeance go that easily. The black carriage rolled deeper into the valley, the rhythmic sound of iron wheels cutting through the mud. Inside, Sarah huddled on the plush leather seat, shivering as the damp cold seeped deep into her bones. She pressed her hand against her stomach, feeling the heavy, soft curves that had made her a target for so much cruelty. For the first time in years, she was not surrounded by walls of rotting wood and the smell of stale whiskey. Through the glass window, she watched Silas riding his stallion right beside the carriage, his face completely expressionless against the rain. He looked like a statue carved from mountain stone, unbothered by the freezing wind or the darkness settling over the plains. An hour later, the carriage slowed down as it approached the massive iron gates of the Vance ranch. The property was legendary in the territory, a sprawling empire of rich black soil, endless timber, and thousands of head of cattle. The main house loomed ahead, a beautiful two-story structure built from thick pine logs and heavy river stone. Warm, golden light spilled from the large glass windows, promising a comfort Sarah had only ever dreamed of. Silas dismounted before the horses even stopped, throwing his reins to a waiting stable hand with a swift jerk of his wrist. He walked over to the carriage and opened the door, extending his large gloved hand toward Sarah once again. "Come inside, Sarah," he said, his deep voice cutting through the howling wind. "The storm is getting worse." Sarah hesitated, looking down at her muddy, torn dress, and then at the clean, polished wood of his front porch. "I'll ruin your floors, Mr. Vance," she whispered, her cheeks flushing with shame as she stayed tucked in the shadows. Silas didn't speak. He simply stepped closer, grabbed her by the waist, and lifted her down from the carriage step. His grip was incredibly firm, his large hands easily wrapping around her full waist, without a single hint of strain or judgment. He guided her into the warmth of the house, closing the heavy oak door behind them to shut out the freezing night. A massive stone fireplace roared in the center of the living room, throwing a deep amber glow across the entire space. Sarah stood on the rug, water dripping from her hair, feeling entirely out of place among the fine wool blankets and leather chairs. An older woman with kind eyes rushed out from the kitchen, holding a thick, dry wool blanket in her arms. "Oh, you poor dear," the woman said, wrapping the soft blanket tightly around Sarah's trembling, broad shoulders. "Martha, get her some hot broth and prepare the guest room on the main floor," Silas ordered, taking off his wet duster coat. He walked over to the fire, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the room as he stretched his hands toward the flames. Sarah wrapped the blanket tighter around herself, the warmth of the fire slowly stopping the violent shaking in her limbs. She looked at Silas, her heart filled with a strange mix of profound gratitude and intense confusion. "Why did you save me?" she asked quietly, her voice barely louder than the crackle of the burning wood. "Everyone in town thinks I'm a monster." Silas turned around slowly, his gray eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, unwavering intensity that made her breath hitch. "The people in that town are fools who only see what they want to see," Silas said, stepping closer to her. "They needed someone to blame, and they thought a lonely woman wouldn't have anyone to stand up for her." He stopped just a foot away from her, his gaze dropping down to her bruised wrists before rising back to her eyes. "But they were wrong," Silas continued, his voice lowering to a dark, protective rumble. "You're safe here, Sarah. Nobody crosses my fence line without my permission, and nobody touches what belongs under my roof. Sarah felt a tear slip down her cheek, but this time it wasn't from fear or the sting of public humiliation. For the first time in her entire life, someone was looking at her heavy frame and seeing a human being worth protecting. Silas reached out, his rough thumb gently brushing the tear away from her dirt-stained cheek, his touch surprisingly soft. "Rest now," he whispered. "Tomorrow, we start turning the tables on the mayor." The morning sun broke through the heavy curtains, casting a warm, golden light across the soft mattress. Sarah opened her eyes, feeling the incredible weight of 3 thick down blankets pressing against her body. For the first time in her life, she didn't awake to the freezing dampness of her cellar or the screaming voice of the mayor demanding breakfast. She rolled onto her side, the expensive feather pillows cradling her head as she looked around the spacious guest room. On a sturdy wooden chair by the wash basin sat a clean, simple cotton nightgown that Martha must have left for her. Sarah sat up slowly, her muscles aching from the rough treatment she had endured in the town square the day before. She looked at her large, heavy thighs and the soft folds of her stomach beneath the sheets, waiting for the familiar wave of shame to hit her. But the room was silent, peaceful, and entirely free of the cruel judgments that had defined her entire existence. She stood up, her bare feet sinking into a thick wool rug that felt like heaven against her calloused soles. After washing her face with the warm water Martha had provided, she slipped into the clean gown and opened the bedroom door. The rich, mouth-watering scent of frying bacon and fresh coffee drifted down the long, polished hallway. Sarah followed the aroma into the massive kitchen, where a large iron stove was cracking with heat. Silas was already sitting at the long oak dining table, a heavy ceramic mug held in his large, scarred hand. He had already changed into a clean, dark blue button-down shirt, his dark hair damp from a morning wash. He didn't look up immediately, his eyes focused on a stack of leather-bound ledger books spread out before him. "Sit down, Sarah," Silas said, his deep, gravelly voice cutting through the quiet hum of the kitchen. Sarah hesitated at the edge of the room, her fingers nervously gripping the fabric of her borrowed nightgown. "I don't want to intrude, Mr. Vance," she whispered, her voice still raspy from the previous night's tears. Silas closed the ledger with a heavy thud and looked up, his piercing gray eyes instantly locking onto her. "You're not intruding," he said firmly, pointing to the chair directly across from him. "Eat. You need your strength." Martha appeared from the pantry, carrying a massive cast-iron skillet loaded with eggs, thick slices of ham, and golden biscuits. She piled a mountain of food onto a white ceramic plate and placed it right in front of Sarah with a warm smile. "Eat up, darling," Martha said softly, patting Sarah's broad shoulder. "You're a growing woman, and this house doesn't skimp on rations." Sarah looked at the incredible amount of food, her stomach grumbling loudly in the quiet room. In town, she was always forced to eat the scraps left behind by the boarders, usually molding bread and cold fat. She picked up her fork with trembling fingers, taking her first bite as Silas watched her with absolute focus. He didn't look at her with disgust as she ate heartily. His gaze was steady, calm, and strangely respectful. "The mayor thinks he can starve people into submission," Silas said, leaning back in his chair and crossing his thick arms. "He's been squeezing the small businesses in the valley for 5 years, using his bank to steal their land." Sarah swallowed hard, setting her fork down as the memory of the town square flashed through her mind. "He's going to come for me, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice trembling. "He won't let a servant girl defy him." Silas leaned forward, his massive chest pressing against the edge of the table as his jaw tightened. "Let him come," Silas muttered, his voice dropping to a dangerous low rumble that sent a thrill down Sarah's spine. "He thinks he rules this territory because he wears a gold watch and a silk tie, but he forgets who owns the dirt beneath his feet." He reached across the table, his large, calloused hand resting near hers, though he didn't quite touch her yet. I spent the morning reviewing my accounts, Silas continued, his eyes burning with an intense, calculated fury. The mayor's bank relies heavily on my cattle deposits to keep its doors open during the winter months. Tomorrow, I am riding into town to withdraw every single dollar I own from his vault. Sarah gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as she realized the sheer scale of what Silas was proposing. "That will ruin him," she whispered, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and sudden, fierce hope. "It's only the beginning," Silas said, a cold, dangerous smile touching the corners of his lips. "He dared to drag you through the mud to cover up his own son's thievery, and he will pay for every tear you shed." He stood up, his tall frame blocking out the kitchen light as he picked up his black hat from the counter. "Martha is going to take care of you today," Silas said, adjusting the brim of his hat over his eyes. "I have a traveling tailor arriving this afternoon to take your measurements for new clothes." Sarah's cheeks flushed a deep, burning crimson as she looked down at her heavy, full figure. "Mr. Vance, please. No tailor will want to work on a body like mine," she stammered, her voice full of old pain. "The seamstresses in town always told me I was a waste of expensive fabric." Silas stopped at the door, turning around slowly to look at her broad hips and the soft, heavy curves beneath the cotton gown. His eyes didn't hold a single ounce of mockery. Instead, they darkened with a deep, unmistakable heat that made her breath hitch. "The seamstresses in town are blind fools," Silas said, his voice thick and deliberate. "You are a magnificent woman, Sarah, and you will be dressed in the finest silk this territory has ever seen." Without another word, he stepped out onto the porch, leaving Sarah standing in the warm kitchen, her heart racing with a feeling she had never known before. The heavy wooden door of the main house opened late that afternoon, admitting a sharp gust of wind and a short, nervous-looking man carrying 3 large leather crates. Mr. Sterling, the most exclusive traveling tailor in the Western Territories, wiped the sweat from his forehead as Silas stepped into the parlor behind him. Sarah stood near the fireplace, nervously smoothing down the oversized wool wrap Martha had lent her to cover her full figure. "This is the lady, Sterling," Silas said, his deep voice commanding the room as he unbuckled his gun belt and laid it heavily on the side table. "I want the finest fabrics you brought from Chicago, and I want them cut perfectly to her frame." The tailor blinked, his eyes traveling over Sarah's wide hips, her thick waist, and the heavy, soft curves of her bust. Sarah shrank back slightly, her cheeks burning with an all-too-familiar humiliation, bracing herself for the inevitable scoff or cruel sigh. In town, the dressmakers had always whispered loudly about how much extra cloth she required, treating her body like an expensive defect. "Well, Mr. Vance," the tailor began, clearing his throat nervously as he unrolled a long cloth measuring tape. "She is quite substantial, and the current fashion calls for a much narrower—" "I didn't ask you about the fashion in Chicago," Silas interrupted, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that made the tailor freeze. "I asked you to dress a beautiful, full-figured woman, and if your shears aren't sharp enough for the task, I'll find a man whose are." Sarah looked up, her breath catching in her throat as Silas stepped closer to her, his gray eyes burning with an intense, protective heat. The tailor swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he quickly opened his leather crates, revealing bolts of rich, dark green silk, deep burgundy velvet, and midnight blue satin. Of course, Mr. Vance," Sterling stammered, pulling out his notepad. "Please, miss, step up onto the wooden platform so I can take the metrics." Sarah stepped onto the low stool, her heart hammering against her ribs as the tailor carefully brought the measuring tape around her hips. She closed her eyes, expecting a snide remark about the numbers, but Silas remained standing right beside her, watching the process with absolute focus. His presence felt like an iron wall between her and the rest of the world, shutting out every insult she had ever endured. 38 on the waist, 52 on the hips, the tailor muttered aloud, writing down the numbers with frantic speed. Silas didn't blink. His gaze traced the lush, heavy curve of her hips and the soft fullness of her shoulders with an unmistakable, quiet reverence. "Make sure the green silk has a deep cut at the collar," Silas ordered quietly, his eyes locking onto Sarah's flushed face. "And reinforce the lining with double-stitched linen so she feels comfortable when she rides." Sarah's eyes flew open, her lips parting in shock as she realized he was spending a small fortune on garments meant exclusively for her comfort. "Mr. Vance, this is too much," she whispered, her voice trembling as the tailor finished his measurements and began packing his tools. "I am just a servant. I don't know how to carry myself in such fine things." Silas waited until the tailor had gathered his crates and scurried out of the room toward the guest house to begin his night's work. The room grew quiet again, save for the crackle of the pine logs burning in the hearth and the steady whistle of the wind outside. Silas stepped onto the low platform, standing so close to Sarah that she could feel the heat radiating from his massive chest. "You are no one's servant anymore, Sarah," he said, his voice a thick, deliberate whisper that vibrated deep in her chest. He reached out, his large, calloused hands gently taking her soft, heavy wrists, lifting them up between their bodies. "Tomorrow morning, I am riding into town to close my accounts at Higgins Bank, and I am taking you with me." Sarah shivered, a sudden wave of panic washing over her, as she pictured the sneering faces of the townspeople and the mayor's cruel smile. "They will stone me, Silas," she breathed, using his first name for the very first time without even realizing it. "They still think I have their gold." Silas squeezed her hands, his grip incredibly firm, his eyes locked onto hers with a fierce, unwavering devotion that made her knees feel weak. "Let them try," Silas muttered, a grim, deadly smile touching his lips. "You will be wearing the finest velvet in this territory, sitting right beside me. I am going to strip that town of every cent it owes me, and then I am going to watch the mayor beg you for mercy." The morning sun glistened off the fresh puddles in the town square as Silas's heavy black carriage rolled to a halt directly in front of the municipal bank. The townspeople stopped dead in their tracks, their jaws dropping as the carriage door swung open. Sarah stepped out onto the iron mounting block, wearing the deep burgundy velvet dress the tailor had finished at dawn. The rich fabric clung perfectly to her wide hips, highlighting the magnificent lush curves of her full figure with absolute elegance. Her hair was pinned up neatly, and for the first time in her life, her chin was held high as she looked over the crowd. The very same shopkeepers who had thrown mud at her 2 days ago now shrank back, stunned into absolute silence by her radiant beauty. Silas stepped down right behind her, his long black duster coat framing his massive shoulders as his silver spurs jingled against the boardwalk. He placed his large gloved hand firmly on the small of Sarah's back, guiding her heavy, graceful frame toward the bank's double doors. Mayor Higgins and his son Julian were already waiting inside the lobby, surrounded by 3 heavily armed town deputies. The mayor's face turned a sickly shade of gray as he saw Sarah walking in like a queen, protected by the territory's most dangerous man. "Silas, what is the meaning of this?" Mayor Higgins blustered, adjusting his gold watch chain with trembling fingers. "You can't bring that criminal in here." Silas didn't say a word. He walked straight to the mahogany counter and slammed a heavy leather satchel onto the wood. "I am here to close my accounts, Higgins," Silas said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that echoed off the high ceilings. "Every single one of them." The bank manager's hands shook so violently he dropped his inkwell, splattering black fluid across the clean floor. "Mr. Vance, please," the manager stammered, looking at the ledger. "Your ranch holds over $40,000 in gold coin here. If you withdraw it today, the bank will collapse." "Then you better start stacking the crates," Silas replied coldly, resting his palm heavily on the pearl grip of his revolver. Julian, the mayor's son, stepped forward, his eyes burning with malice as he stared at Sarah's stunning transformation. "You destroying our town for this fat servant girl?" Julian sneered, pointing a finger at her full chest. "She's a thief, and everybody knows it." Silas moved so fast, the deputies didn't even have time to reach for their holsters. His large hand shot out, grabbing Julian by the throat and slamming him face first against the heavy iron bars of the teller window. A sharp crack echoed through the room as Julian's nose broke, blood immediately staining his silk vest as he gasped for air. The deputies drew their pistols, but before they could level them, the heavy double doors of the bank burst open completely. 10 of Silas's roughest ranch hands filed into the lobby, their repeating rifles cocked and pointed directly at the lawmen's chests. "Drop the iron," Silas ordered the deputies, his grip tightening on Julian's throat until the boy's face turned purple. The deputies slowly lowered their weapons, realizing they were completely outmatched and outgunned by the Vance crew. Silas reached into his duster coat with his free hand and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, throwing them onto the counter. "These are the shipping manifests from the midnight freight train," Silas announced, his voice slicing through the tense silence. 2 nights ago, 3 crates of bank gold were loaded onto a private car registered under Julian Higgins' name. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she looked at the paperwork proving her absolute innocence. The mayor sank back into a leather chair, his chest heaving as his entire web of lies crumbled in front of his employees. "Your son robbed his own father's bank to pay off his gambling debts in Kansas," Silas said, throwing Julian to the floor like a sack of grain. "And you decided to hang a poor innocent woman just to save your family's pathetic reputation." The bank manager looked at the documents, his face turning pale as he looked up at the ruined mayor. "It's true," the manager whispered, his voice trembling. "The serial numbers match the missing reserve blocks." Silas turned his back on the broken politicians, looking down at Sarah with a gaze full of fierce, burning pride. He reached into the leather satchel on the counter, pulling out a heavy stack of legal deeds he had acquired earlier that morning. "As of 8 o'clock this morning, I have bought every single mortgage and debt note this bank held against the town's merchants," Silas said. "From this day forward, Mayor Higgins, you don't own a single square inch of this valley." He walked over to Sarah, offering his strong arm to her as the ranch hands began loading the heavy gold crates onto his wagon. Sarah slipped her hand over his sleeve, her heart swelling with an overwhelming sense of victory and profound gratitude. The entire town was watching through the glass windows as Silas escorted his plus-size queen out into the crisp autumn air. They knew the balance of power had shifted forever, and the woman they had mocked was now the most powerful figure in the territory. The heavy oak doors of the bank slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing like a thunderclap across the silent town square. Sarah walked down the wooden steps, her hand resting firmly against Silas's strong, solid forearm as the velvet of her dress brushed against her boots. The very same crowd that had gathered to destroy her 2 days ago now stood paralyzed along the boardwalks, their eyes wide with disbelief. They looked at the massive crates of gold being loaded onto Silas's heavy supply wagons, and then they looked at Sarah, stunned by her regal posture. The cruel whispers about her full figure had completely vanished, replaced by a heavy, suffocating awe as her lush curves filled the expensive burgundy fabric. Silas stopped at the edge of the street, turning his tall frame toward the gathering crowd of townspeople who watched from a safe distance. He didn't raise his voice, but his deep, gravelly tone carried easily through the crisp, quiet autumn air, freezing every man and woman in place. "Listen to me carefully, every last one of you," Silas announced, his gray eyes sweeping across the frightened faces of the shopkeepers and laborers. "The Higgins family is finished in this valley, and their debt notes now belong exclusively to the Vance estate. If any man in this town ever speaks a disrespectful word about Sarah or looks at her with malice, I will call in his mortgage before sunset." A collective shudder ran through the crowd, several merchants nodding frantically as they realized their entire livelihoods now depended on her favor. Silas turned back to Sarah, his stern, rugged face softening as he looked into her bright, tear-filled eyes. He lifted her carefully into the black leather carriage, his large hands lingering on her wide waist for a warm, reassuring moment before he climbed in beside her. As the carriage pulled away from the town square, Sarah looked out the window, watching the broken, bleeding Julian being dragged toward the town jail by his own former deputies. The old life of starvation, humiliation, and endless labor was completely gone, left behind in the mud of the square where she had once begged for mercy. An hour later, the carriage arrived back at the grand ranch house, the afternoon sun casting a brilliant crimson glow across the sprawling, wealthy valley. Silas led Sarah into the great room, where Martha had already set up a massive feast on the long oak table to celebrate their return. Before she could sit, Silas took her hands in his grip warm and incredibly firm as he forced her to meet his intense, unwavering gaze. "You don't ever have to look down at the dirt again, Sarah," Silas whispered, his voice thick with a raw, protective devotion that shook her to her core. "This ranch, this land, and every single thing I own now belongs to you as much as it does to me." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a heavy gold ring set with a brilliant, polished river diamond, slipping it gently onto her finger. "I want you by my side permanently, not as a guest, but as my wife and the true queen of this entire territory." Sarah wept, but for the first time in her life, her tears were born from absolute happiness and the profound security of being deeply loved and desired. She pressed her heavy, soft frame against his massive chest, feeling his strong arms wrap around her, shielding her from the world forever. Now, we want to hear from you. If you were in Sarah's shoes, would you ever forgive the townspeople who turned their backs on you? Or would you use your new power to make them pay for every insult? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.